Before Anonymous. Before Kevin Mitnick. Before hacking became a household word. There was a 16-year-old girl who could talk her way into a NY system with nothing but a phone. Susan Thunder didn't need code. She didn't need computers. She weaponized something far more dangerous: human psychology. By 1979, this teenage social engineering mastermind was manipulating phone company employees, government workers, and corporate executives into handing over their most classified secrets. The FBI called her more dangerous than any virus. Kevin Mitnick himself learned from her techniques. Yet her name was buried, her story erased from tech history books. Why don't you know about the woman who invented modern hacking? And what happened to her after she vanished from the underground scene at just 19 years old? Drop A, if you think. Susan Thunder deserves recognition as the true pioneer of social engineering. Comment below. What other forgotten tech legends should we uncover? The year was 1979, and 16-year-old Susan Headley had just discovered something that would change the underground world forever. The human voice was the ultimate hacking tool. While other tech enthusiasts her age were fumbling with primitive computers and learning basic programming, Susan was pioneering something far more sophisticated and dangerous: the art of social engineering. Born in Los Angeles to a middle-class family, Susan seemed like any other California teenager. She had blonde hair, a bright smile, and the kind of innocent voice that could melt hearts over the phone. But behind those blue eyes was a mind that worked differently, one that could dissect human psychology with surgical precision and exploit the fundamental weakness in every security system. Trust. It all started with a simple phone call to Pacific Bell. Susan had heard whispers in the early computer bulletin board systems about something called phone phreaking, the practice of manipulating telephone systems to make free calls. While her male counterparts were building blue boxes and trying to mimic the electronic tones that controlled phone switches, Susan took a different approach entirely. Why hack the machine when you could hack the human operating it? "Hi, this is Susan from the repair department," she would say in her sweetest voice to unsuspecting phone company employees. "I'm having trouble accessing the central office records. Could you help me verify some line configurations?" Within minutes, she would have access codes, employee passwords, and internal phone numbers that took others months to discover through technical means. Her reputation in the underground began to spread like wildfire. In an era when hacking was dominated by socially awkward males hunched over computer terminals, Susan Thunder, the name she adopted from her fascination with thunderstorms, represented something entirely new. She was charming, articulate, and devastatingly effective. More importantly, she was completely invisible to law enforcement, who were still focused on tracking down people with technical skills. The phone phreaking community of the late 1970s was small and tight-knit. Legendary figures like John Draper, Captain Crunch, and Joe Ingrisha, the Whistler, were already household names in hacker circles. But when Susan entered the scene, even these titans took notice. She wasn't just making free phone calls. She was extracting information that seemed impossible to obtain. Susan's methods were revolutionary in their simplicity. She would spend hours studying organizational charts, memorizing employee names, and learning corporate jargon. When she called a target company, she didn't sound like a teenager from California. She sounded like she belonged there. She understood that people were naturally helpful, especially when approached by someone who seemed to be part of their in-group. The key, she would later explain to those lucky enough to learn from her, is never to ask for what you really want directly. You build rapport, establish credibility, and then guide the conversation so they offer you the information themselves. Her first major score came when she successfully convinced a Bell Labs engineer to explain the entire structure of their internal security protocols. The engineer, believing he was talking to a colleague from another department, spent over an hour, detailing weaknesses and backdoors that no external hacker had ever discovered. Susan recorded every word. By the end of 1979, Susan Thunder had become a legend whispered about in electronic bulletin boards and late-night phone conferences. She had proven that the future of hacking wasn't just about understanding machines. It was about understanding people. In a world obsessed with technical complexity, she had weaponized something beautifully simple: conversation. But this was only the beginning. The teenage girl who could talk her way into any system was about to catch the attention of someone who would change her life forever and introduce her to the most dangerous game in the digital underground. Kevin Mitnick was already a name that made corporate security officers lose sleep. But in 1980, even he had never encountered anyone quite like Susan Thunder. The 19-year-old hacker from Van Nuys had built his reputation on a combination of technical prowess and social engineering. But when he first heard Susan's voice over a crackling long-distance phone connection, he knew he was talking to someone who operated on an entirely different level. Their introduction came through the underground phone network that connected hackers across the country. Susan had been making waves with her incredible ability to extract sensitive information from major corporations. And Kevin, always eager to learn new techniques, had tracked down her number through mutual contacts in the freaking community. "I heard you got the new area code split information 3 weeks before it was publicly announced," Kevin said during their first conversation. "How?" Susan laughed, a sound that had disarmed countless corporate employees. "I called the planning department and told them I was from the customer notification team. Said I needed to verify the timeline for our mass mailing campaign." She paused, letting the simplicity sink in. "They gave me everything, which numbers were changing, the exact date, even the internal memo about expected customer complaints." Kevin was stunned. While he had been breaking into computer systems and dumpster diving for discarded documents, Susan was simply asking for what she wanted and getting it. It was elegant, efficient, and nearly impossible to trace. Thus began one of the most influential partnerships in hacking history. Kevin became Susan's eager student, learning not just her techniques, but her philosophy. "People want to help," Susan taught him. "They want to feel important, useful. If you approach them correctly, they'll give you their most sensitive secrets and thank you for asking." Under Susan's tutelage, Kevin's already impressive skills skyrocketed. She taught him how to research targets, how to adopt the right persona for each situation, and most importantly, how to sound like he belonged wherever he was calling. "Never sound desperate," she would coach him. "Sound bored, slightly annoyed even. Like this call is routine for you, but an interruption in your busy day." Their collaboration reached legendary status in the hacker underground when they successfully penetrated the security at Pacific Bell's central switching office. While Kevin handled the technical aspects, understanding how the phone systems worked, Susan orchestrated the social engineering campaign that got them inside information. She began by calling the facility's administrative office, posing as a new employee in the HR department. Over the course of several calls spread across 2 weeks, she built relationships with multiple staff members, learning names, schedules, and internal procedures. She discovered who had access to what areas, which managers were traveling, and when security was lightest dot, the breakthrough came when Susan convinced a security guard to explain the entire badge access system to her. "I'm updating the emergency procedures manual," she told him. "If there's a fire or other emergency, I need to know all the ways people can exit the building safely." The guard, proud of his knowledge and wanting to be helpful, walked her through every access point, every override code, and every security camera blind spot. Armed with Susan's intelligence, Kevin was able to physically infiltrate the facility and access computer terminals that controlled phone service for millions of customers. They didn't damage anything. That wasn't the point. They simply wanted to prove it could be done. The success of this operation cemented their partnership and established Susan as the premier social engineering expert in the underground. But it also attracted attention they hadn't anticipated. Corporate security teams began sharing information about suspicious calls from young-sounding women. The FBI started a file with Susan's coding name. The golden age of invisible hacking was coming to an end, and Susan Thunder was about to learn that. Her greatest strength, her voice, was also her most identifying weakness. By 1981, Susan Thunder had evolved from a curious teenager into the most feared social engineer in the underground. Her techniques had become so sophisticated that she could extract information from targets who had been specifically trained to recognize social engineering attacks. She had turned deception into an art form, and every conversation was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. Her methodology was unlike anything the security world had seen before. While traditional hackers relied on technical vulnerabilities, bugs in software, weaknesses in hardware, or exploitable network protocols, Susan had discovered that the most critical vulnerability in any system was human nature itself. She understood that people's desire to be helpful, their need to appear competent, and their natural trust of authority figures could be weaponized with devastating effectiveness. Susan's preparation for each target was meticulous. She would spend weeks researching companies, studying their organizational structures, memorizing employee names, and learning industry jargon. She subscribed to trade publications, collected company newsletters, and even attended public corporate events to gather intelligence. By the time she made her first call, she knew more about the target company than many of its own employees. Her persona collection became legendary among those who knew her work. Susan could seamlessly transform herself into anyone: a harried executive's assistant, a confused new employee, a government regulator conducting an audit, or a vendor trying to resolve a billing issue. Each character was complete with appropriate background knowledge, speaking patterns, and emotional motivations. One of her most impressive operations targeted a major defense contractor. Susan had spent months building a complete false identity as a Pentagon liaison officer. She created fake credentials, established a government office mailing address through a mail forwarding service, and even had business cards printed with authentic-looking government seals. When she finally contacted the contractor, she wasn't just pretending to be a government official. She had become one, at least on paper. "This is Colonel Patricia Hayes from Defense Contract Management Agency," she would announce in a crisp, authoritative voice. "I'm conducting a routine audit of your security protocols for Project Blackbird. I need to verify that your personnel security procedures are in compliance with current regulations." The target company's security director, faced with what appeared to be a surprise government audit, immediately became cooperative. Over the course of several phone calls, Susan extracted detailed information about the company's classified projects, employee clearance levels, physical security measures, and computer access protocols. She learned which employees had access to which systems, where classified documents were stored, and even the company's procedures for handling security breaches. But Susan's true genius wasn't just in gathering information. It was in leaving no trace. Her conversations felt natural, helpful even. Targets often ended calls feeling good about the interaction, believing they had successfully navigated a government audit or helped a colleague solve a problem. They had no idea they had been manipulated. Her success attracted students from across the underground. Young hackers would call her, hoping to learn her secrets. Susan was selective about who she taught, but those she chose to mentor received an education in human psychology that would serve them throughout their careers. She taught them to listen, not just to what people said, but how they said it. She showed them how to identify personality types and tailor their approach accordingly. "Everyone has a different trigger," she would explain. Some people respond to authority, others to friendship. Some want to feel important, others want to avoid trouble. Your job is to figure out what motivates your target and then become whatever they need you to be. By late 1981, Susan had successfully penetrated systems at major corporations, government agencies, and telecommunications companies. She had proven that no organization was immune to social engineering, no matter how sophisticated their technical security measures might be. But her very success was creating a problem she hadn't anticipated. She was becoming too well known. Security professionals began sharing stories about suspicious calls from articulate young women. Training programs started including warnings about social engineering attacks. The invisible hacker was becoming visible, and that visibility would soon put her in mortal danger. The phone rang at 3:17 a.m. on a cold December night in 1981. Susan Thunder, now 18 and at the height of her powers, answered with the practiced alertness of someone accustomed to late-night calls from the underground network. But the voice on the other end wasn't from her usual circle of hackers and phone freaks. Susan Headley? The voice was professional, cold. "This is Agent Johnson from the FBI. We need to talk." For the first time in her criminal career, Susan felt genuine fear. The FBI had found her. Worse, they knew her real name. The invisible hacker had become visible, and the consequences would be more dangerous than she could have imagined. The federal investigation into Susan's activities had been building for months. Corporate security directors from across the country had been reporting suspicious calls from articulate young women seeking sensitive information. The pattern was too consistent to ignore, and the FBI's newly formed computer crime unit had been tasked with identifying the source. Agent Johnson represented a new breed of federal investigator, one who understood that the future of crime wasn't just about traditional fraud or theft, but about information warfare. He had been tracking Susan's digital footprints through the underground bulletin board systems where she was discussed in whispered, reverent tones. More importantly, he had convinced several of her victims to cooperate in building a case. "We know what you've been doing," Johnson continued during that terrifying phone call. "We have recordings, documentation, witnesses. You're looking at federal charges for wire fraud, computer fraud, and conspiracy. That's 20 years minimum." But then came the offer that would change everything. "Or you could work for us." The FBI's proposition was elegant in its simplicity. Susan's skills, her ability to penetrate any organization through social engineering, were exactly what the federal government needed. The Cold War was at its peak in American intelligence. Agencies were desperate for new ways to gather information about Soviet capabilities and intentions. Traditional espionage was dangerous and slow. But someone who could simply call the Kremlin and convince a clerk to reveal state secrets, that was invaluable. Susan found herself at an impossible crossroads. Accept the FBI's offer, and she would become a government asset, using her skills to serve the country that was threatening to imprison her. Refuse and face decades in federal prison for crimes that, until recently, most people didn't even understand were possible. The decision was made more complex by what Agent Johnson revealed about the scope of the investigation. They didn't just want Susan. They wanted her entire network. Kevin Mitnick, her students, her contacts in the phone phreaking community. They were all targets now, and Susan's cooperation could determine their fates as well. "Think about it," Johnson said before ending the call. "You have 48 hours to decide. After that, we proceed with the arrests." Those 48 hours were the longest of Susan's life. She couldn't contact her usual network without risking their safety. She couldn't flee without abandoning everything and everyone she cared about. And she couldn't trust anyone, because she didn't know how deep the federal investigation went, or who might already be cooperating. The weight of her decision was crushing. For years, she had been the puppet master, controlling conversations and manipulating outcomes. Now she was the one being manipulated, forced to choose between her freedom and her principles, between her loyalty to the underground community that had embraced her and her own survival. During those sleepless hours, Susan realized that her greatest strength had also been her greatest vulnerability. Her voice, the tool that had made her legendary, had also made her identifiable. Every phone call had been a risk, every conversation a potential trap. She had believed herself invisible, but she had actually been building a trail of evidence with every word she spoke. The underground was buzzing with rumors. Word had leaked that federal agents were asking questions about social engineering attacks. Paranoia swept through the hacker community as everyone wondered who would be next, who might already be under surveillance, and most terrifyingly, who might decide to cooperate with the government to save themselves. On a foggy San Francisco morning in January 1982, Susan Thunder walked into the federal building on Golden Gate Avenue and made the decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She had chosen survival over solidarity, cooperation over imprisonment. But as she sat across from Agent Johnson and his team of federal prosecutors, she realized that working for the FBI would extract a price far greater than she had imagined. "Welcome to the other side, Miss Headley," Johnson said, sliding a thick manila folder across the conference table. "Your first assignment." The folder contained detailed intelligence requirements that made Susan's blood run cold. The FBI wanted her to target her own community. They wanted her to use her social engineering skills to gather evidence against Kevin Mitnick, her other students, and dozens of hackers she had considered friends. She wasn't just being asked to become a government asset. She was being turned into a weapon against the underground world that had created her. The federal strategy was methodical and ruthless. Susan would continue her hacking activities, but now every conversation would be recorded. Every piece of information she gathered would be shared with law enforcement. She became a double agent in a war most people didn't even know was being fought. Her first target was devastating: Kevin Mitnick himself. The FBI wanted everything: his techniques, his contacts, his planned operations. They wanted Susan to manipulate the person who had been both her student and her closest ally in the underground. The irony was crushing. She would use the social engineering skills Kevin had learned from her to destroy him. "Kevin trusts you completely," Agent Johnson explained during one of their regular briefings. "He'll tell you things he wouldn't tell anyone else. We need you to find out about his next major target, his methods for avoiding detection, and most importantly, we need evidence that will hold up in court." Susan's first recorded conversation with Kevin felt like emotional torture. His voice was warm and familiar as he shared his latest discoveries about telephone system vulnerabilities. He spoke to her with the openness of someone who had no reason to suspect betrayal. With every word he said, Susan knew she was building the case that would eventually destroy him. The psychological toll was immediate and severe. Susan had always prided herself on her ability to compartmentalize, to separate her emotions from her operations. But betraying people who trusted her, people who had welcomed her into their community and treated her like family, was different. From manipulating corporate security guards or government bureaucrats, she began having nightmares, waking up in cold sweats after dreaming about Kevin and the others discovering her treachery. She lost weight, developed insomnia, and found herself unable to concentrate during her FBI briefings. Agent Johnson, observing her deterioration, offered what he probably thought was reassurance. "You're doing important work for your country," he told her. "These people are criminals. They're stealing from corporations, compromising national security. You're helping us protect America." But Susan knew better. The hackers she was betraying weren't motivated by greed or malice. They were driven by curiosity, by a desire to understand how systems worked, and to push the boundaries of what was possible. They were rebels, not terrorists. And many of them were just kids, like she had been when she first discovered her gift for social engineering. The final blow came when the FBI asked her to target a 16-year-old hacker named Mark, who had been seeking her mentorship. Mark reminded Susan of herself at that age, brilliant, curious, and naive about the consequences of his actions. The FBI wanted her to encourage him to attempt increasingly serious intrusions, building a case that would allow them to prosecute him as an adult. "I can't do this," Susan told Agent Johnson during what would be their last official meeting. "I won't destroy a kid's life to make your case statistics look better." Johnson's response was swift and merciless. "You don't have a choice. You signed an agreement. You're ours now, for as long as we need you. Unless you'd prefer to reconsider that 20-year prison sentence we discussed." But Susan Thunder had one more card to play, one that the FBI had never anticipated. She had been recording their conversations too. That night, Susan made a series of encrypted calls to trusted contacts in the underground. Within hours, word spread through the hacker community. Susan Thunder was compromised. The legend who had taught them all about social engineering had herself become a victim of the ultimate manipulation. By dawn, Susan Headley had vanished completely. She abandoned her apartment, her identity, and her life in California. The FBI lost their most valuable asset, and the underground lost its most innovative teacher. Susan Thunder, a first-grade hacker in history, simply disappeared into the shadows she had once used to hide her greatest victories. The price of survival, it turned out, was everything she had ever cared about. Susan Thunder vanished in 1982, but her legacy shaped an entire generation of hackers and forever changed how we think about cybersecurity. Her techniques are still studied in security training programs today, and her influence can be seen in every social engineering attack that makes headlines. Kevin Mitnick, despite everything, would later credit Susan as his greatest teacher. The methods she pioneered, psychological manipulation, authority impersonation, and trust exploitation, became the foundation of modern social engineering. She proved that the human element would always be the weakest link in any security system, no matter how sophisticated the technology became. What happened to Susan Thunder after 1982 remains one of the underground's greatest mysteries. Some say she assumed a new identity and continued her work in secret. Others believe she went legitimate, using her skills to help corporations protect themselves from the very attacks she had perfected. A few insist she's still out there, training a new generation of social engineers in the art of invisible infiltration. The truth is, Susan Thunder achieved something most hackers never could. She became truly invisible. Her greatest hack wasn't against a corporation or government agency. It was against history itself. By disappearing completely, she ensured her legend would grow far beyond what any documented career could have achieved. In an age where every digital action leaves a trace, Susan Thunder reminds us that the most powerful tool in any hacker's arsenal isn't code or technology. It's the human voice and the trust it can inspire.